Knock, knock, howdy, folks. Dr. Ben here. You're listening to the Dr. Ben and Friends podcast. We're putting the med in comedy. Today we have surgical first assistant Adam with us. Mr. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we have a history professor and comedian, Dr. Ben Sawyer, with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, listener and guests, are you ready to play Headline or Hoax? Headline or Hoax. I'm going to read two medical headlines. One's an actual medical headline and one is a hoax. And you two will try to determine which one is the actual medical headline. And my email box is flooded with various headlines of various medical topics. And some are so outlandish, think to myself, that can't be true. And it's an actual medical headline. So I'm going to read a couple of headlines and you're going to try to decipher which one you think is an actual medical headline. Listener, you guess too. Okay, ready for the first one? Let's scrub in for this one. Headline number one is, a woman's gut microbes brewed their own booze. A woman's gut microbes brewed their own booze. That's headline one. Headline two, ready, is, traditional snake oil surges in popularity among athletes for joint pain. Traditional snake oil surges in popularity among athletes for joint pain. All right, now you guess. Think carefully, listener. Think deliberately. Let's not get this one wrong. Let's debate about which is the real headline here.
Well, look, I'm from the country, and I've dated some girls that honestly seemed like their bodies were producing alcohol inside of them all the time. But then you meet their moms and you'd be like, nah, they're probably just born with a lot of it in there. You know what I'm saying? It's probably just taking a while for their body to filter it out.
Okay.
I do think that athletes love their snake oil.
Mm-hmm.
And snake oil has been popular for a very long time, but I don't know if I'm convinced.
Okay. Not convinced about that. All right. And we're... Professor Ben's writing down his answer. We're writing down which one we think is the real medical headline. All right, Mr. Adam, what do you think is the real?
I think the first story, the gut microbes.
The gut.
Yeah.
A woman's gut microbes brewed
I
their
think
own
she's
booze.
I actually think it is gut moonshine. I think it is gut moonshine.
Yeah.
All right, listener, which one did you think? Okay. Well, folks, we've had various responses here. Sometimes both guests have got them right. Sometimes they both got them wrong, and sometimes there's a split decision. So, all right, folks. Well, the actual headline is number one. A woman's gut microbes brewed their own booze. Okay. Yeah. There is a medical condition called Autobrewery syndrome.
What?
Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Who named it?
Autobrewery.
Jack
true.
Daniels.
You want to use some Latin in there? Nah.
No, autobrewery syndrome. ABS. Working on my abs. But sometimes the gut flora, particularly if you have yeast.
It sounded yeasty.
Yes. It can ferment carbohydrates and then make ethanol as a byproduct. And so these patients swore they didn't drink and they didn't, but were intoxicated with high levels of blood alcohol. And particularly in this headline, in Canada, doctors were seeing a patient in the emergency room, slurring her speech, failing breathalyzers, swore she didn't drink anything, and turns out she was intoxicated, and her stomach had turned into a microbrewery. So,
well, that's a nice way of saying it. I mean, I guess if she was a little bit obese, they wouldn't have called it a microbrewery, so good for her. But also... police officers of the world, get ready for this one. Get ready for it.
That's right.
I swear I didn't drink anything.
Yeah, because in Canada, they'll
How
just
many
say,
have you had to
what's
drink?
that a boot?
What's that a boot?
But in the U.S., it might be a little different.
Yes. I wonder if they have to take breathalyzers before getting into their car.
They should. I mean, how would it be?
Would it come out on the breathalyzer, or would maybe it be
right? They were actually
flatulence or something? I don't know.
Oh, it'd have to be
It's
a blood
fartalizer.
test. Yeah,
They
dude,
have to
it's
fart into
a
this.
special seat in the car.
Yeah. Detects how much.
It's a new invention when you sit down.
We all just got rich.
The fertilizer.
We're patenting that right
Patent
now.
pending.
So, but snake oil is popular, and it does have some medicinal effects in controlling inflammation and joint pain.
Dr. Ben, are you selling snake oil on this podcast? What's going on?
No, not selling snake oil. But that was during the gold rush. The Chinese immigrants used it quite frequently to help with joint pain historically. And so, but then it came to have this connotation that, because some people were not actually using snake oil, they're using fake ingredients for placebo because it was cheaper. And so then it became kind of this connotation of, oh, it's just snake oil.
Yeah, snake oil is short term for anything, basically fake sold out of the cart, right?
But can it be any snake? I mean, I feel like this is very...
This was a Chinese water snake, but...
A Chinese water
Not
snake.
like
You
a
can go to the
garter
store and be like, I got some juice. Juice is good for things. And
Yeah,
you're like,
just that Black
juice?
Mamba drink.
The Black Mamba.
Juice? Like what kind? Don't worry about it. Snake. It's snake juice.
Yeah, snake's a premium.
Yes. But do you think the Arizona Diamondbacks use a lot of snake oil?
I don't know. That'd probably be on the banned PED list.
Yeah, I think it would be weird if they were just out there being like, yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, our mascot, Daryl the Diamondback. And they just go out there and snap his neck and shake him upside down to get his juice out.
Need a home run. It's bottom of the ninth.
Why are they paying so much for this job nowadays? I don't get it. Why is it always open?
All right. And we do have a history professor with us. The Clark Stanley, the rattlesnake king, busted in 1916. He was busted for selling fake oil with zero snake in it, but saying he was selling snake oil. And in 1906...
Did he have to change it to call it snake drink? Is that what
That's right. Snake-like.
Snake flavored drink.
They had to label it. Made
I know
with
what that
bits
is.
of real snake. All right. There was no snake in it, just mineral oil and turpentine. And then in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was established to protect consumers from crooks like this Clark Stanley. So snake oil is now slang for fraud, as we mentioned. So don't fall for the hype. All right.
Actually, Pure Food and Drug Act, very important.
Yes, tell us more about that.
Have you guys ever heard of Kinder Surprise eggs?
Mm-hmm.
You know about these eggs? You live in Canada, so you know the Kinder Surprise eggs are different down here, right?
Yeah.
Those ones up there are chocolate, right? The whole thing's chocolate, and inside's a really cool toy. But here, it's just half plastic. And everyone, a few years ago, people heard this story. A woman got in trouble trying to bring the original Kinder Surprise eggs back from Canada because they're illegal here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And everyone assumed that it was some ridiculous policy that because the reason we can't sell the thing inside the chocolate egg is because it's a choking hazard. You've heard about this, right?
Right. Yeah, that's what they'd say back in like the 90s.
Yeah, they said it was a choking hazard. Now, you know how big that toy is in the inside.
Right.
If you choked on that, you were trying to swallow it, and you should
It was
have
an
known
accidental.
better. That's not actually why. The reason they're illegal here is because the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act makes it illegal to encase any non-food item wholly inside of a food item.
Wow. Okay.
And that goes back to the fact that sausage producers were dumping sawdust into the sausage
As a
because they
filler?
sold it by weight.
Ah.
And so you can either have 100 pounds of meat, right? And 20 pounds of sawdust, or as they used to call it, 120 pounds of meat. And so it was so bad that to get around it, they actually had to say, should we say you can't put sawdust in there? They're like, nah, they'll just put something else. So since it was a sausage, right, in the wrapper, they just said you can't sell
Non-food.
any
No
non-food item
non-food.
wholly encased inside of a food item.
Wow.
It's very generic, and I understand the reasoning, but also maybe not necessary for everything.
Well,
Now we
you
just
don't-
use water, inject it, right?
Well, that's great and everything, but if you knew anything about what happened when there was no regulations, i.e.,
Oh, yeah.
like the Gilded Age, you got to make it broad for those guys.
Yeah. What happens if you bite into like a sawdust hot dog? Is that the real taste of the ballpark? Or?
It is. It's the taste of the last ballpark they tore down, and I needed to do something
Right.
with the rubble. Dumps are expensive.
Yeah, they
these
use
days,
bat
so.
ash from old bats.
I like it.
Look, the thing about the Pure Food and Drug Act is it doesn't cover everything,
Mm-hmm.
nor does the FDA. These evolutions. So I love the fact that there's this loophole for like anything that is a supplement, which may or may not be what it says it is. And I think it was protein powders. Did you guys hear about the amount of, was it mercury that's in protein powders?
A lot of them.
Oh, wow.
Because they're not subject to testing. So I would go look at this study because it's surprising how much just straight up poison is in some of these by what they're processing.
That's why you have independent labs that kind of review that stuff.
To which I reply, no way. WHEY.
Oh, yeah.
You're more of an egg protein guy.
That's like, no way would be a good
No
campaign.
way. But you can put toys like in Cracker Jacks and cereal boxes, and that's okay.
But they're in the box.
Because
not
it's
inside the
yeah,
food.
it's
They're in the
like a
box, but not
plastic
in the
sealed
food.
in the box.
But what if you're
but-
eating your Cracker Jacks and you
Well,
get a toy?
again, that's on you.
But that's not a
on
choking
you.
hazard.
Free
Okay.
toy inside, or as I like to call it, what killed Grandpa.
Yeah, I call that the parenting problem.
This is a crazy story. Is that like during the Revolutionary War, there were actually like what we might consider to be like there's like bio warfare going on, because if the enemy soldiers got smallpox, that was like a great boon to you. And so the British would actually try to put people who had smallpox in the path of where the Patriots were marching, in hopes they would contract it and get it there. So actually, in the winter of the first winter they camp after 1776, right after Trenton and Princeton, crossing the Delaware, Washington makes all of his men get variolated, right, which is like the early form where they just straight up exposed you. It was very imprecise, right? But they would expose you to the live from another
vaccination
from another person's wound from smallpox, and he made his men go through it, including his wife, who he thought was almost going to. She looked like she might pass away because it was imprecise. So sometimes people would just get it, but if you made it through it, you had a higher tolerance
Immunity.
there. And I've heard people argue, and I haven't read into the nuts and bolts of the argument, but some people have argued that was the smartest thing he did, because the rest of the time when his troops were in the field, they weren't subject to those things.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. And variolation was the original form of vaccination they came up with after observing that, cowpox is what jumps to human beings and becomes smallpox, right? So the way they figured this out was they observed that the women who milked cows didn't get smallpox as bad.
Huh.
And they figured out that they were in closer proximity. And this goes back to the reason that Europeans had better resistance to it. Like smallpox would still wipe people out. But when it came to the New World,
It was new. Yeah.
it hit them hard, right? It's because Europeans lived in close proximity with livestock. In the 1600s, 1500s, in the winter, you had to bring your livestock in a lot of Northern Europe, and you would bring them into your housing because they also produced warmth. So even if you weren't milking them and dealing with these, open wounds that the cows had, you still were in some proximity, which made while individual, you could still get sick and die. Across the board, it kind of gave some general endurance, to it.
So are you saying that cows in the kitchen was the original heater?
Cows in the Kitchen was the original heater, yes, in fact. And also the original, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, solution to smallpox. But Native American peoples didn't, there weren't beasts of burden like that. So it wasn't even a version of that came through, and they were, because you have the llama in South America, but aside in North America, there's nothing like that.
It's interesting. I know Washington, obviously great American, did have some weird ideas. I mean, I think, didn't he die largely due to bloodletting?
That wasn't on him.
No, it's not. It's his doctor. Yeah.
After Washington died, actually, a friend of the family who had been studying medicine, I think it was at Penn, that's kind of one of the early medical schools, came to Martha Washington and asked if she would like him to try a technique he had recently been studying to reanimate a corpse.
Oh.
Yes. She said no.
Okay.
And if she hadn't, George Washington, look, they wouldn't stop asking him to do stuff. He tried to leave, and they just kept on nagging him. All he wanted to do was die at home, and it was like the only thing he got to do that he wanted to do in like the last 30 years of his life. If he would have gotten to do that and you would have taken it away from him, he would have been furious. And I will point out, now a zombie.
Yeah. Zombie Washington's running for a third term.
Exactly. Eternal term, right?
That's awesome. Well, thank you both for that insight. That was great. All right, knock, howdy, folks. Dr. Ben here. Now it's time for the Dr. Ben Buzz Battle. B3, like the vitamin we never needed. Now, in this portion of the podcast, we have an honorary medical doctor,
I think
Dr.
that's symbolic right there.
Ben Sawyer. He's a comedian and history professor, and he's going to be our honorary surgeon today. And sitting alongside me, we have a first assistant who actually is in surgery, Mr. Adam, and he and I are going to kind of comment and maybe critique your technique here. But honorary Dr. Ben here is going to remove as many ailments as he can in 60 seconds. We have 12 different ailments here. And first of all, we should probably perform a timeout, don't you think, Adam?
Yeah, I do believe that is standard.
Make sure we have the correct patient.
Patient's name is Leslie Lynch King Jr. in honor of President Gerald Ford, who had that original name until he changed it when he was like 21.
All right. And we are here to remove 12 different ailments. And you, when the timer starts, you'll have 60 seconds to remove as many ailments as you can, including like butterflies in the stomach, frogs in the throat. Are you ready, Dr. Ben?
I am.
Okay. And our patient here, how did he injure himself?
He did the Pedal Tavern tumble.
Oh, all right. Those are dangerous, folks. Be careful. All right. And we're going to put 60 seconds on the clock for Dr. Ben to remove as many ailments as he can when the buzzer goes. Okay. All right, Adam. You're in surgery with me. Let's check
He's
this
going
technique.
straight for the teddy bear. I don't know about that.
All right. So we have Dr. Ben here. He's trying to remove some ailments.
There's a frog in the throat there, but he croaked it.
Oh. Do you think it's anesthesia's
It's
fault
always
here
anesthesia's fault.
The table height's probably not correct, or patient's moving.
That's right.
Patient's moving anesthesia.
Patient's not trained.
Or some sort of wrist injury there. Bold move.
All right, Dr. Ben here is... Okay, do you need any music in the operating room?
I think probably.
Okay.
Too late for that, guys.
Some classic rock.
On the line.
Okay,
Yeah, maybe smooth operator.
smooth operator.
Or maybe not for this one. Doesn't look like it.
Oh, like a surgeon.
So close.
How would you even get some of these out of here?
What about the first cut is the deepest?
All right.
Okay, let's count. How many did Dr. Ben Sawyer cure our patient? Count them up.
1, 2, 3,
4?
4. I got 4.
All right, 4.
This patient
Yeah,
might live.
Okay.
This really makes it clear to everybody how hard this job is that they do.
It's
Dr.
very
Ben-
similar.
Yeah, Dr. Ben did let me use the actual tool he uses to fix people's bones here. And I can't imagine how stressful it is in the surgery room.
In an actual-
when it buzzes when you hit a different organ.
And it does do that too.
Yeah.
Obviously this was realistic.
But we had to just keep going on. when we
The
get that
AI
buzz.
is amazing these days.
It really is. I'm so sorry, Leslie Jr.
No, that might be a success though. Curing 4 ailments in 60 seconds.
It's at least something you can bill for.
It is. It is. And be glad I paid my medical insurance premiums for the other ones.
Yeah, you've probably met your deductible now.
He still has a brain in his bear.
All right, listener. If you have access to this game, we want to see how many ailments you were able to cure your patient of in 60 seconds. Did you have more or less than 4? All right.
And it has to
Let
be
us
the
know.
first time, too. Don't go trying like
Yeah,
6
don't
times to
practice.
get better at
Exactly.
it. All right? I came in here
Yeah.
cold, all right?
First
That's right.
time,
We do
that's
it
right.
in one take. One take.
Think you're better than me? Okay. Maybe you are this, but don't act like that, okay?
That's right. First time. All right.